Hello, and welcome to Medieval Nocturnes. Tonight, we're setting aside the grand tapestries of kings and conquests for something a little more grounded, a little more greasy, and a lot more common. We're delving into the world of medieval junk food. Yes, even in a time without glowing golden arches or 24-hour drive thrusts, the craving for a quick, savory, and often questionable snack was very much alive. It was a world of food born from necessity, ingenuity, and a delightful disregard for what we might now call best before dates. Before we unwrap our first course on this journey, if you enjoy exploring these quieter corners of history, please take a moment to subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes, and perhaps leave a comment to let us know where in the world you're listening from. It's always a wonder to see our global fellowship of night owls and history lovers. Now, find a comfortable spot, dim the lights, and let the hum of the present fade away as we travel back to a time when a hot, greasy pie was the peak of culinary convenience. Imagine a bustling medieval market. The air is thick with the smells of damp earth, livestock, and wood smoke. Amid the clamor of merchants hawking their wares and the chatter of the crowd, a particular aroma cuts through the noise, the scent of baked pastry and savory, spiced meat. This is the scent of the meat pasty, arguably the most iconic and essential junk food of the Middle Ages. This wasn't a delicate dish for a banquet table. This was the original handheld meal, a medieval hot pocket designed for a world in motion. Its beauty was its utility, a full meal encased in its own edible and sometimes disposable container. The crust of a medieval pasty was a masterpiece of engineering, not of delicate French patisserie. It was called a coffin or huff paste, and its primary job was not to be flaky and light, but to be tough and durable. Made from a simple, rugged dough of flour, water, and lard or suet, this pastry was built to withstand the rigors of a working day. It had to be strong enough to hold a piping hot, often wet, filling without collapsing, and sturdy enough to be carried in a pouch or pocket without crumbling into a useless pile of crumbs. This was a crust with a purpose, a barrier against the dirt, grime, and general unpredictability of medieval life. Now, while the crust of the pasty was its armor, the filling was its soul, and the soul of a medieval pasty could be a very mysterious thing indeed. In an ideal world, if you were a landowner or had a successful hunt, your pasty would be brimming with hearty, recognizable chunks of venison, pork, or mutton. The meat would be diced and slowly stewed with onions, carrots, and perhaps some turnips, seasoned generously with salt, pepper, and fragrant herbs like thyme and sage, creating a rich, savory gravy that would soak beautifully into the bottom crust. Breaking one of these open would release a fragrant cloud of steam, a promise of a truly satisfying meal. But, for the average person, the reality was often far more ambiguous. Meat was a precious commodity, and waste was a sin. This philosophy gave rise to what we might affectionately call the mystery filling. The contents of a pasty bought from a street vendor were a matter of trust, or perhaps a willful suspension of disbelief. The diced meat could be anything that was cheap, available, and could be cooked into submission. This included rabbit, pigeon, squirrel, or any other small game that found its way into the cook's pot. The clever disguise of a pastry shell meant that plausible deniability was baked right in. This culinary creativity sometimes ventured into more exotic territory. In coastal or riverside towns, it wasn't uncommon for eel to be the star ingredient, a creature both plentiful and, to our modern sensibilities, an unusual choice for a pie. Some historical accounts even mention stranger fillings, like hedgehog or rook, proving that if it could be caught, it could be diced, seasoned, and encased in pastry. This wasn't about being gourmet, it was about protein and calories. The chopped, stewed nature of the filling meant that the exact origin of the meat became a soft, savory, and largely unidentifiable part of the whole experience. The great equalizer in this culinary lottery was the heavy-handed use of seasoning. Spices were the medieval cook's greatest ally, not just for adding flavor, but for masking it. A generous amount of black pepper, garlic, onion, and maybe a pinch of nutmeg or mace, if the cook was feeling lavish, could transform a questionable stew into a delicious and aromatic filling. These strong flavors helped to disguise any gaminess or lack of freshness in the meat, a crucial trick in an age before refrigeration. You didn't question what was inside. You simply enjoyed the comforting warmth and bold, spicy taste and hoped for the best. Of course, there were also vegetarian versions, especially for the numerous fasting days dictated by the church, such as Lent. On these days, meat was forbidden, but the desire for a hot pasty remained. These would be filled with a savory mix of root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, and turnips, along with leeks, onions, and sometimes cheese or eggs to bind it all together. These vegetable pasties were just as hearty and served the same purpose: a warm, portable, and complete meal, proving the pasties' incredible versatility in the medieval diet. The genius of the meat pasty was not just in its ingredients, but in its profound practicality. It was the ultimate working person's companion, a self-contained, portable, and calorie-dense meal that fueled the engine of medieval labor. Imagine a farmer heading out to his fields at dawn. He wouldn't carry an elaborate lunch pail. He would have a warm, weighty pasty tucked into a cloth sack. Hours later, under the midday sun, he could sit down and have a hot, filling meal without needing a fire, a plate, or even clean hands. The same was true for travelers, soldiers, and merchants on the road, for whom the pasty was a reliable source of sustenance in an uncertain world. Perhaps the most iconic association for the pasty is with the tin miners of Cornwall, a tradition that likely has deep medieval roots. The mining environment was grimy, and workers' hands were often coated in soot, dirt, and even toxic dust like arsenic. The classic Cornish pasty developed a distinctive feature to solve this problem: a thick, rope-like crust crimped along one edge. This edge was not intended to be eaten. It served as a disposable handle, allowing the miner to hold his meal and eat the clean, enclosed portion without contaminating it. Once finished, the soiled crust could be tossed aside, a small offering to the knockers, the mythical spirits or goblins said to inhabit the mines. In a world where many people shared a communal kitchen or bakehouse, telling one person's lunch from another's could be a challenge. To solve this, a simple and charming tradition emerged, marking the pasties. A wife or mother preparing a pasty for a member of her family would often carve their initial into the raw pastry before it was baked. You can picture a cooling rack filled with golden brown pasties, each bearing a unique letter, a W for William, a T for Thomas. It was a simple, loving gesture that ensured the right lunch got to the right person, a small mark of identity on a humble piece of food. While the pasty was undeniably the food of the common folk, its more refined cousins, pies, were not entirely absent from the tables of the nobility. A lord or lady would not be served a simple mutton and turnip pasty, of course. Their pies were grand affairs, filled with expensive cuts of meat, exotic game birds like swan or peacock, and seasoned with the most costly imported spices like saffron, cloves, and mace. These pies were often decorated elaborately, sometimes with the bird's head and feathers reattached after baking for a dramatic presentation. It was the same basic concept, filling encased in pastry, but elevated to a performance of wealth and status. Ultimately, the pasty has endured for centuries, precisely because it is a perfect food, a testament to medieval ingenuity. It was more than just junk food. It was survival food, a hearty and reassuring presence in a world that was often harsh and demanding. It was a food that understood the needs of its time, providing warmth, energy, and comfort in a single, convenient package. Its legacy is not just in its recipe, but in its role as a silent, steadfast companion to the countless working people who built the medieval world, one savory bite at a time. Let us move now from the savory world of the worker's lunch to the sweeter, stickier side of medieval snacking. Imagine yourself at a bustling town fair on a crisp autumn day. The air is alive with the sounds of minstrels, the laughter of children, and the shouts of vendors. In the midst of this cheerful chaos, a sweet, inviting aroma drifts towards you, the smell of hot oil and cooking fruit. You are smelling what was, for many, a rare and delightful treat, the apple fritter. In a diet often dominated by salted meats, coarse bread, and boiled vegetables, a fritter was a small, golden-brown pocket of pure joy. The apples that went into these fritters were not the pristine, uniform specimens you find in a modern supermarket. They were the real apples of the medieval world, small, often knobby and misshapen, with a tartness that would make you pucker. These were the windfalls gathered from the orchard floor, or the hearty, sour varieties that grew wild behind the village alehouse. A cook would chop them up roughly, sometimes not even bothering to remove the core, valuing the substance of the fruit over its perfect appearance. These weren't apples for displaying in a bowl. These were apples destined for a glorious, bubbling bath of hot fat. The batter for a medieval fritter was a simple, hearty concoction. It was typically a mix of flour and eggs, but the liquid used to bind it together was often not water. Clean drinking water could be a risky proposition in many medieval towns, so a much safer and frankly more cheerful alternative was used: ale. A splash of the local brew would be stirred into the flour, creating a thick, lumpy batter that would cling to the apple pieces. This addition of ale would have given the finished fritter a subtle, malty undertone, adding a layer of complexity to its flavor. The frying itself was a piece of public theater. A vendor would have a large, blackened iron pan or cauldron set over an open flame, filled with bubbling, sizzling animal fat, usually lard or tallow. This fat was often reused until it was dark and pungent, a practice that, while questionable to us, was believed to add a certain depth of flavor. Spoonfuls of the battered apple would be dropped into this cauldron of shimmering, hot grease. The sound would be immediate and dramatic, a loud sizzle and spit as the batter crisped up, sealing the soft, sweet apple within. The entire process was a spectacle of sound, smell, and a hint of delicious danger. Pulled from the hot fat and allowed to cool for just a moment, the finished fritter was a thing of rustic beauty. It was an irregularly shaped golden puck, with a wonderfully crispy, uneven exterior, giving way to a soft, almost molten center of cooked apple. To eat one was to risk a minor burn on your tongue from the steaming fruit, a risk well worth taking. It was a perfect contrast of textures and tastes, the greasy crunch of the fried batter, the sweet and tangy burst of the hot apple, a simple, indulgent treat that could make any market day feel like a celebration. A freshly fried fritter, hot and steaming, was a delight on its own. But the final touch was what truly transformed it from a simple snack into a memorable indulgence. How it was finished often depended entirely on your station in life. If you were wealthy, a merchant, a knight, or a member of the nobility, your fritter might be delicately dusted with a fine white powder. This was sugar, a fantastically expensive luxury imported at great cost from distant lands. To sprinkle sugar on a common street food was the ultimate flex, a casual display of wealth that announced to everyone watching that you could afford to literally eat your riches. For the vast majority of people, however, refined sugar was as unattainable as a king's crown. Their fritters were finished with a much more common, yet no less delicious, sweetener, honey. A vendor would take a wooden spoon or ladle and drizzle a thick golden stream of local honey over the hot fritters. Sometimes this honey would be infused with spices like cinnamon or ginger, creating a warm, aromatic syrup that clung to every nook and cranny of the crispy batter. This sticky, sweet glaze was the taste of affordable luxury, a familiar comfort that made the treat all the more satisfying. Fritters were a remarkably democratic food, enjoyed by nearly everyone. You would see them at all sorts of public gatherings. Children, their faces already sticky, would beg their parents for one more. Laborers, taking a break from their work, would savor the quick rush of sugar and fat. Even the well-to-do, while trying to maintain an air of dignity, couldn't resist buying a portion, carefully eating it to avoid getting grease on their fine tunics. They were sold outside churches after Sunday service, at seasonal fairs, and on bustling market days, serving as a universal reward for a day's devotion or a hard week's work. Of course, the quality was wildly inconsistent. This was, after all, fast food from the 1300s. There was no quality control. Some days, the fritters were perfect golden orbs of delight. On other days, the fat might be old, giving them a rancid taste. Sometimes they were left in the cauldron for a moment too long and came out as hard, scorched nuggets, or pulled too soon, leaving a gooey, uncooked batter on the inside. The apples could be more sour than sweet, the batter suspiciously chewy, but that was part of the gamble. And when they were good, they were so good that you forgot all the mediocre ones you had before. While apple fritters were the undisputed champion, the term fritter applied to a wide range of fried snacks. The basic method, dipping something in batter and frying it, was incredibly versatile. Depending on the season and location, you might find fritters made with pears, berries, or other fruits. But there were also savory versions. A cook could mince herbs, greens, or root vegetables, mix them into the same simple batter, and fry them up as a hot, savory snack. In coastal areas, you might even find fritters made with small pieces of fish or shrimp. The fritter was less a single recipe and more a delicious, deep-fried state of mind. Let's now journey away from the sizzling cauldrons of the town fair and into the cool, quiet stone dairy of a medieval farmstead. Here, amidst the earthy scent of hay and fresh milk, we find our next snack. It isn't baked or fried, and it isn't particularly sweet, but it was one of the most common and comforting snacks of the age. The cheese curd, To understand the curd, you must first forget everything you know about modern, artfully aged cheeses. Medieval cheese wasn't about complex flavor profiles. It was about one thing: preservation. It was a practical, straightforward method of turning perishable milk into a food that could last through a long winter. So what, exactly, is a cheese curd? In the simplest terms, it is baby cheese. Curds are the very first step in the cheese-making process. The fresh, solid clumps that form when milk begins to sour and separate. A farmer or dairymaid would take a large cauldron of fresh milk, warm it gently over a low fire, and then add a substance called rennet. While it sounds technical, rennet was an entirely natural product, usually derived from the stomach lining of a young calf or lamb. This enzyme would work its magic on the milk, causing it to coagulate and separate into two distinct parts: the solid white curds and the watery cloudy liquid known as whey. Once the milk had properly curdled, the real work began. The cheesemaker would use a large cloth or a sieve to scoop the solid masses out of the whey. These fresh curds were then lightly pressed to squeeze out more of the liquid, and finally, they were tossed with a generous amount of coarse salt. The salt was crucial, not only for adding flavor, but for drawing out more moisture and acting as a preservative, which was vital in an age without refrigeration. And that was it. The process was complete. There was no aging, no pressing into molds, no wrapping in wax. The curds were ready to eat, right then and there. To eat a fresh cheese curd was to experience a unique combination of taste and texture. They were mild, milky, and satisfyingly salty. But their most famous characteristic, then as now, was the distinctive squeak they made against your teeth as you chewed. This squeak was the hallmark of absolute freshness. The texture could vary from batch to batch. Sometimes they were soft and crumbly, melting in your mouth, while other times they were firmer and more rubbery, with a satisfying chew. It wasn't a bold or exciting flavor, but it was nourishing, comforting, and deeply satisfying. This simple, squeaky snack was a peasant's treasure. For farmers, monks, and travelers, a handful of fresh cheese curds was a perfect, portable source of protein and fat. It required no cooking and no special preparation. You could grab a handful while working in the fields, pack them in a cloth for a short journey, or simply enjoy them as a byproduct of the day's cheese-making efforts. They weren't a food for feasts or celebrations. They were a food of daily life, a humble, reliable, and quietly delicious piece of the medieval world. While eating a fresh, salty cheese, curd by the handful was the purest way to enjoy it. This humble snack was more versatile than you might think. In the medieval kitchen, where no food was wasted, curds found their way into a number of simple dishes. A cook might crumble them over a thick vegetable pottage, where they would soften in the heat, adding a rich, creamy texture and a welcome touch of saltiness. They could be mixed with chopped herbs and a bit of onion and spread thickly onto a slice of dark, coarse bread, making a simple meal far more substantial and flavorful. On special occasions, if a household had a surplus of precious cooking fat, the curds might even be fried. Tossed into a hot skillet with bubbling lard, they would turn golden brown and crispy on the outside, while the inside became soft and slightly molten. This was a rare treat, a way to transform a simple dairy product into a hot, savory indulgence. It wasn't the elegant, stretchy cheese pull we know today, but it was a warm, satisfying dish that would have felt wonderfully decadent to the person eating it. Monasteries, which were often significant centers of agriculture and cheesemaking, were places where curds were a dietary staple. For a monk living a life of prayer and labor, a simple meal of bread and a bowl of fresh curds was both nourishing and compliant with religious custom. On days when the consumption of meat was forbidden, cheese provided a vital source of protein. You can easily picture a monk in his quiet cloister, breaking his fast not with an elaborate feast, but with the simple, honest sustenance that came directly from his monastery's own herds and dairy. The great paradox of the cheese curd, however, was its fleeting perfection. That delightful squeak, the very sign of its freshness, was incredibly temporary. In a world without any form of refrigeration, a batch of cheese curds was a food that existed only in the present moment. They were best eaten on the very day they were made. Within a day or two, they would lose their signature squeak, their texture would soften, and their mild, milky flavor would begin to develop a pronounced sour taste. They were still edible, of course, but they were no longer the treat they once were. This perishability made them the ultimate local, seasonal snack. Because of this rustic simplicity and fleeting nature, you would never find cheese curds served at a nobleman's banquet. They were unequivocally peasant food, too fresh, too simple, and too unrefined for the aristocratic palate. The wealthy preferred their cheeses aged for months or even years, until they were hard, sharp, and pungent. An aged cheese was a symbol of wealth, representing the resources needed to store and manage food over long periods. The humble curd, in its immediate and perishable honesty, represented the exact opposite, the simple, fleeting, and delicious reality of life on the land. Our journey now takes us away from the farm and the fairground and into the grand dining hall of a medieval castle. The feast has ended. The tables are littered with the remnants of roasted meats, rich sauces, and empty wine goblets. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and revelry. But with such indulgent food and drink came to inevitable consequences: indigestion and less than fresh breath. In an era where dental hygiene was rudimentary at best, the medieval elite had a small, sophisticated, and surprisingly delicious solution: the candied fennel seed. Fennel itself was a well-known and widely used herb throughout the Middle Ages. Its seeds, small and ridged with a powerful and distinctive anise-like flavor, were praised for their medicinal properties. Physicians and herbalists believed that chewing on fennel seeds could aid digestion, calm an upset stomach, and, most importantly, mask the pungent aftereffects of a garlic-heavy meal. A small bowl of raw fennel seeds might be passed among guests after a feast, a simple and effective folk remedy. But the true luxury was not in the seed itself, but in its transformation. The process of candying, or creating what was known as a comfit, was a highly skilled and laborious art form. A confectioner would take the fennel seeds and place them in a special tilted pan over a gentle heat. A thin layer of sugar syrup was poured over them, and the pan was constantly shaken and agitated, rolling the seeds until the syrup dried into a thin, hard coating. This process was repeated again and again, sometimes for days, with the confectioner meticulously adding layer upon layer of sugar. The goal was to build up a perfectly smooth, hard, white shell around each individual seed, a testament to patience and precision. Because sugar was an exorbitant luxury, and the process was so time-consuming, candied fennel seeds were exclusively a treat for the wealthy. They were a definitive status symbol. After a banquet, a servant might present them to guests in a small, ornate silver or ceramic dish. To be offered these comfits was a sign of your host's generosity and refinement. The act of eating one was equally delicate. A guest would politely take a single seed and pop it into their mouth, a small, elegant gesture to conclude the meal and cleanse the palate. The experience of eating a candied fennel seed was a study in contrasts. First, there was the hard, sweet crunch of the sugar shell, which would have been a significant dental hazard if you bit down too eagerly. You had to be careful, letting it crack between your teeth. This initial sweetness was immediately followed by the surprising and powerful burst of the herbal licorice-like flavor from the fennel seed trapped within. It was a tiny explosion of flavor, simultaneously sweet and medicinal, that left the mouth feeling clean and refreshed. It was part candy, part medicine, and entirely a symbol of a sophisticated, if not always comfortable, world. The art of candying was by no means limited to the humble fennel seed. In the confectionery kitchens of the wealthy, this technique was applied to a wide array of seeds and spices, creating an entire category of after-dinner treats known collectively as comfits, or, more simply, spices. Caraway and aniseeds were popular choices, as were tiny slivers of warming ginger root or pungent cloves. Even flower petals, like violet or rose, could be painstakingly coated in layers of sugar, transforming them into delicate, edible jewels. A truly magnificent host might present their guests with a spice plate, an assortment of these tiny candy-coated morsels, showcasing a variety of flavors and textures. These treats were central to a specific and exclusive social ritual, known as the main banquet was over and the long tables were cleared. The most important guests would be led away from the great hall to a smaller, more intimate chamber. Here, they would be served cups of sweet, spiced wine, like hippocras, and presented with these elegant spice plates. This was the true end of the evening, a time for private conversation, political maneuvering, or simple relaxation away from the noise of the main feast. There was a mark of honor, and the comfits served were a key part of its refined atmosphere. The line between medicine and candy was incredibly blurry in the medieval mind. According to the prevailing medical theory of the four humors, a person's health depended on a balance of hot, cold, wet, and dry elements in the body. Heavy, rich foods were often considered cold and wet, and it was believed that they needed to be counteracted by something hot and dry to ensure proper digestion. Spices like ginger, cinnamon, and cloves were classified as hot and dry. Therefore, eating these candied spices after a meal wasn't seen as a mere indulgence. It was considered a vital and healthy practice to rebalance the body's humors and prevent illness. For the common person, of course, a formal with plates of sugar-coated ginger was pure fantasy. A peasant or a simple townsperson had far more rustic methods for freshening their breath or settling their stomach. They would simply chew on a sprig of fresh parsley from their garden, a few mint leaves, or the same raw fennel seeds that the nobles were eating in their candied form. If they wanted a sweet treat, they might try to replicate the idea by mixing seeds with thick, sticky honey. The result would be a lumpy, messy cluster, a world away from the elegant, hard-shelled comfit, but providing a similar combination of sweet and herbal flavors. Ultimately, these tiny candied spices represented more than just a snack or a digestive aid. They were a taste of a much wider world. The sugar, the cinnamon, the cloves, these were not products of the local English or French countryside. They were precious goods that had traveled thousands of miles along dangerous trade routes from the Middle East, India, and beyond. For a medieval lord or lady, to casually nibble on a candied clove was to partake in global commerce, a tiny, sweet, and powerful reminder of their wealth and their connection to the exotic and mysterious lands of the East. Having explored the delicate, sugar-dusted world of the nobility, let us return to the heart of the medieval village. Here, a different kind of sweetness reigned supreme, one that was golden, sticky, and came not from a distant trading ship, but from the buzzing hives in a nearby meadow. We are talking, of course, about honey. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, honey was the primary and often only sweetener available, and its most beloved application was in the creation of the honey cake. This was not a light, airy sponge cake, but something far denser, richer, and built to last. The ingredients for a medieval honey cake were as humble as they were hearty. The base was usually a coarse flour, perhaps from barley or rye, which gave the cake a dark color and a rustic texture. To this, a baker would add water, or, once again, a bit of ale, and maybe an egg or two, if the chickens had been generous. But the star of the show was the honey, which was added in copious amounts. It provided not just sweetness, but also moisture, and, crucially, a preservative quality that made these cakes incredibly durable. The resulting batter was thick, heavy, and wonderfully sticky. Baking this dense concoction was a challenge. Most medieval homes did not have their own private ovens. These were luxuries reserved for castles and manors. A village might share a single, large, communal oven, or a home cook would bake on a flat hearthstone placed directly in the embers of the fire. The honey cake would be shaped into a round or a slab and baked slowly until it was firm and deeply browned. The final product was less a delicate cake and more a substantial, chewy confection, with a firm crust and a moist, dense interior. To eat a medieval honey cake was an experience in texture and taste. Slicing it required a sturdy knife and a bit of effort. The cake was firm and almost leathery, with a satisfyingly dense chew. The flavor was intensely sweet, dominated by the rich, floral, and sometimes slightly musky taste of the honey. It would stick to your fingers, your teeth, and the roof of your mouth. This wasn't a dessert to be eaten daintily with a fork. It was a rustic treat to be held in your hand and savored slowly, a concentrated burst of sweetness in a single, heavy slice. These cakes were incredibly popular for festivals, feast days, and celebrations like weddings or harvests. Their durability was a key reason for this. A honey cake could be baked days in advance and would not spoil quickly. It could be wrapped in cloth and carried on a journey, or stored for a week without going stale. In fact, its flavor often improved with a bit of age. It was a reliable and impressive centerpiece for any special occasion, a sweet, sticky, and shareable symbol of community and celebration in the medieval world. A simple honey cake was a treat in itself, but for those with a bit more means, or for a particularly special occasion, this humble dessert could be embellished and elevated. The most common way to enrich a honey cake was by adding dried fruits. Chopped raisins, figs, or dates could be stirred into the thick batter, creating pockets of intense, chewy sweetness that contrasted beautifully with the dense cake surrounding them. These fruits were often expensive and had to be imported, so their inclusion was a clear sign that this was no ordinary, everyday cake. For an even greater display of luxury, a baker might add spices, a pinch of precious cinnamon, a grating of nutmeg, or a few ground cloves could completely transform the flavor profile of the cake. The marriage of warm, aromatic spices with the rich sweetness of honey is a timeless combination, and medieval cooks understood its appeal well. You can imagine a baker carefully measuring out a tiny amount of a costly spice, a fragrant dust that represented a significant expense, and mixing it into the batter. This spiced honey cake was the direct ancestor of the modern gingerbread or spice cake we know today. Because they were so durable and held a certain celebratory status, honey cakes were often used as gifts. They were a common present to give on New Year's Day, a sweet offering to wish someone a prosperous year ahead. A well-made honey cake might be given to a landlord as part of one's rent, or presented to a local lord or priest as a sign of respect and goodwill. Their sturdiness meant they could be sent with a traveler on a long journey, a comforting and long-lasting taste of home to sustain them while they were away. The dense, firm texture of the honey cake was not seen as a flaw. It was part of its character and its utility. Unlike a delicate cake that would crumble in a day, the honey cake was built to endure. This made it a powerful symbol. In a world where life could be uncertain and fleeting, the honey cake represented something lasting and reliable. Its sweetness didn't fade quickly. It was a food that embodied the values of preservation, preparedness, and a deep appreciation for the sweet moments when they came. So, while it may not have been a delicate dessert by our standards, the honey cake was a cornerstone of medieval celebration and hospitality. It was a canvas for demonstrating a bit of wealth with the addition of fruits and spices, a vessel for carrying good wishes, and a comforting, reliable presence on the feast day table. It was a food that was as tough, resilient, and enduringly sweet as the people who baked and enjoyed it. Our culinary tour now leads us to the wind-swept coasts and bustling riverbanks of medieval Europe. Imagine a fishing village at the end of the day. The boats have returned, their nets heavy with herring, cod, and mackerel. On the docks, the fish are being processed with swift efficiency, gutted, filleted, and prepared for the market or the salting barrel. This process created a significant amount of waste: heads, bones, and most importantly for our story, skins. In a world where every calorie was precious, one person's trash was another person's treasure, and fish skin was a treasure waiting to be discovered. No one set out to invent this next snack. It was almost certainly born of thriftiness and a flash of culinary inspiration. A cook, faced with a pile of shimmering, discarded fish skins, must have wondered if they could be made into something edible. They were likely scraped clean of any remaining flesh, perhaps cut into thin strips, and then subjected to the medieval cook's favorite problem-solving technique, dropping them into a pan of hot, bubbling fat. The result was something astonishing, a snack so unexpectedly delightful it earned a firm place in the medieval junk food repertoire: fried fish skin cracklings. The transformation in the hot pan would have been immediate and dramatic. The soft, pliable skins would curl and tighten, sizzling and spitting as the moisture evaporated and the natural oils rendered out. They would puff up slightly, becoming incredibly light and brittle. Within moments, what was once a slippery piece of waste became a crispy, golden brown wafer. The air would fill with the intense, savory aroma of fried fish and salt, a smell that would have been irresistible to anyone nearby. The finished product was a marvel of texture and taste. These cracklings were paper-thin and so brittle that they would shatter with a satisfyingly loud crunch the moment you bit into them. The flavor was intensely savory and deeply fishy, like a concentrated burst of the ocean, enhanced by a generous sprinkling of salt. For a modern palate, the closest comparison might be a pork rind, or perhaps a very rustic, umami-rich potato chip. It was a simple, powerful, and incredibly addictive flavor. This cheap and crunchy snack was a natural fit for taverns and alehouses, especially in coastal communities. Tavern keepers could produce them for next to nothing, using the leftovers from the day's catch. Their intense saltiness had the added benefit of making patrons incredibly thirsty, encouraging them to order another round of ale. You can easily picture a rough wooden bowl of these cracklings sitting on a tavern counter, with sailors and fishermen grabbing them by the handful, the loud crunch adding to the rowdy atmosphere of the room. It was the perfect no-west snack for a maritime world. The utility of fried fish skin cracklings extended far beyond the walls of the alehouse, thanks to their three key properties, being lightweight, high in fat and salt, and relatively non-perishable if kept dry. They were an ideal food for travelers. A sailor heading out to sea for weeks on end, a soldier on the march, or a pilgrim on a long and arduous journey could pack a small cloth sack full of these cracklings. They took up little space, weighed next to nothing, and provided a powerful burst of savory energy and salt, which was essential for replenishing the body after a day of hard labor or walking. Of course, the quality of these cracklings would have varied immensely, depending entirely on the type of fish they came from. The skin of an oily fish, like a herring, mackerel, or salmon, would produce a rich, intensely flavorful crackling that was full of energy. The skin from a leaner white fish, such as cod or haddock, would result in a more delicate and less greasy, but still satisfyingly crunchy, snack. Sometimes, if the cook was hasty, the skins might not have been perfectly scraped, leaving small scales attached, which after frying would add another layer of perhaps slightly unwelcome texture to the crunch. The most significant drawback to this otherwise perfect snack was, of course, the smell. Frying a batch of fish skins was an overwhelmingly aromatic affair. The pungent, oily scent would permeate the entire house, clinging to clothes, hair, and the very walls for days. If you were making them indoors, your home would smell like the inside of a fisherman's boot for a solid week. This was a snack that proudly announced its presence to the entire neighborhood, a clear olfactory signal that someone was being both incredibly thrifty and was likely preparing for a party or a long journey. This powerful aroma and humble origin cemented the fish skin crackling as a food of the common people. You would never see a bowl of these served at a noble's feast. It was far too rustic, too pungent, and too obviously made from a waste product. The nobility preferred their fish served in elegant, refined ways, poached in wine, baked in a salt crust, or served in a delicate jelly. The idea of eating the fried skin would have been seen as uncivilized. This was food for the working class, for the people who lived by the sea and understood that no part of the precious catch should ever be thrown away. In the end, the fried fish skin crackling is a perfect testament to the ingenuity and resourcefulness of the medieval cook. It represents the pinnacle of the waste, not, want not philosophy. To take something that would otherwise be discarded and with nothing more than hot fat and salt, transform it into a delicious, practical, and even profitable food item is a special kind of culinary magic. It's a snack that tells a story of survival, of practicality, and of a deep and respectful connection to the resources provided by the natural world. We venture now into one of the most curious corners of the medieval menu, into a world born of desperation and astonishing creativity. Let's start with a simple premise. Dessert is not a right, it is a privilege. For most people in the Middle Ages, with sugar being an unimaginable luxury, and fresh fruit a seasonal treat, a sweet course was a rare event. So, what did you do when you craved something sweet, but all you had was the humble, mundane contents of your root cellar? You looked at the most common, most boring vegetable you had, and you asked yourself, what if this were a pie? And thus, the turnip pie was born. Let's be clear about the main ingredient. The medieval turnip was not the small, tender vegetable we might find today. It was often a large, fibrous, and quite bitter root vegetable. It was, however, incredibly cheap, easy to grow in almost any soil, and it stored exceptionally well through the cold winter months. For many peasants, the turnip was a daily staple, a reliable source of calories that was often boiled into a bland, uninspiring mush. It was survival food, not celebration food, which makes its transformation into a dessert all the more remarkable. The process of creating a turnip pie was a battle against the very nature of the turnip itself. First, the turnips would be peeled and boiled for a very long time, often in multiple changes of water, to soften their texture and leach out some of their inherent bitterness. Once cooked into submission, they were mashed into a thick, pulpy mass. To this vegetable base, the cook would add whatever sweeteners they had on hand. A generous amount of honey was essential, and perhaps an egg to help bind the mixture together and give it a richer consistency. This sweet, earthy mash was then poured into a familiar vessel, a sturdy pastry crust, the same tough, practical huff paste that was used to make meat pasties, served as the container for this unlikely filling. The crust performed two vital functions. First, it made the dish feel more substantial and special. Anything baked in a crust felt like a pie. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it served as a convenient disguise. From the outside, a golden brown turnip pie looked just like any other, its humble origins safely hidden from view until the first slice was served. The moment of truth came with the first bite, and the experience could vary wildly. If the cook was skilled and lucky, the turnip pie could be surprisingly pleasant. It would be warm, gently sweet, with a soft, earthy texture reminiscent of a modern pumpkin or sweet potato pie. It wouldn't be delicious, perhaps, but it would be comforting. However, if the turnips were too bitter or the honey too scarce, the result was far less appealing. It would taste exactly like what it was: sweetened, boiled livestock feed, pretending to be dessert, a testament to the fact that while you can put a turnip in a pie, you can't always hide the truth. Given the gamble of a basic turnip pie, a resourceful cook would use every trick at their disposal to nudge the odds in their favor. The goal was to distract the palate and create a more convincing illusion of a true dessert. The most effective tool for this was spice. A grating of precious nutmeg, a dash of cinnamon, or a pinch of ground ginger could work wonders, lending a warm, aromatic quality that helped to overpower the earthy, vegetal taste of the turnip. The addition of chopped, dried fruit, like raisins or currants, also helped by providing bursts of concentrated sweetness and a contrasting, chewy texture. It was a culinary sleight of hand, using strong, desirable flavors to mask the pie's humble secret. This was, without question, a food of the common people. You would find turnip pies at a village harvest festival or on the table of a farmer's family on a feast day. Monasteries, with their large, well-tended gardens and need for self-sufficiency, were also known for this kind of culinary experimentation. For a monk, turning the garden's surplus of root vegetables into a sweet treat for a special occasion was a perfect exercise in thrift and ingenuity. A nobleman, however, would have been horrified at the thought. To him, a vegetable pie was a savory dish, and dessert was made from expensive fruit and sugar, not the same food his livestock might eat. So why did the turnip pie endure? Because it was about more than just taste. It was about the deep psychological comfort of ritual. Having a pie for dessert was a symbol of celebration, of a special occasion. The familiar round shape and the golden pastry crust spoke of abundance and festivity, even if the filling was made from the cheapest vegetable in the ground. It allowed people with very little to participate in the ceremony of a proper meal, to feel a sense of normalcy and even indulgence. It was, in its own way, an aspiration baked in a crust. The underlying principle was not limited to turnips, either. The practice of using vegetables in sweet dishes was a common medieval solution to the scarcity of fruit and sugar. Carrots, which are naturally sweeter, were a popular choice for puddings and pies. Parsnips, with their earthy sweetness, were also used in a similar fashion. In some recipes, even beans were mashed, sweetened, and used as a filling. But the turnip pie remains the most legendary of these creations, precisely because it represents the greatest culinary challenge, the transformation of the blandest and most commonplace of vegetables into something aspiring to be a treat. In the grand story of medieval food, the turnip pie is not a hero of flavor. It is a hero of spirit. It represents a refusal to be constrained by circumstances, a deep-seated human drive to create a moment of celebration and sweetness from the most basic of ingredients. It's a testament to the enduring power of hope and ingenuity, and the belief that with enough effort, a sturdy crust, and a little bit of honey, you can find a reason to celebrate almost anything. Let us now turn our attention to the two great pillars of the medieval diet, bread and ale. For most people, these were not just parts of a meal, they were the meal itself. But both came with their own challenges. Ale could be inconsistent, and bread, without modern preservatives, had a very short shelf life. Within a day or two, a hearty loaf would become as hard as a wooden board, nearly impossible to chew. In a world where throwing away food was unthinkable, this presented a daily problem. The solution was simple, ingenious, and created what might be the ultimate medieval comfort food: bread soaked in ale. This dish, known variously as soups, sops, or even trench toast, was born from pure necessity. Imagine taking a thick slice of yesterday's bread, so stale and hard you could use it to knock on a door. You place this slice in a simple wooden bowl. Then you take the other staple of your diet, ale. This wasn't the strong, hoppy beer we know today, but a weak, low-alcohol and nutritious small beer that was a primary source of hydration for everyone, from laborers to children. You would gently warm this ale and pour it over the slice of hardened bread. The magic of the dish was in the transformation. The stale bread, like a thirsty sponge, would greedily soak up the warm liquid. Its rigid, unyielding structure would soften and swell, breaking down from an inedible rock into a thick, warm, spoonable mush. There was no complex recipe, no special technique. It was a dish made of 2 ingredients and a little bit of patience, a perfect example of turning leftovers into a warm and satisfying meal. Now, we must be honest about the taste. This was not a gourmet experience. It was the medieval equivalent of French toast, but stripped of all its luxuries. There were no eggs, no cinnamon, no sugar, and very little joy beyond the simple comfort of a warm belly. It tasted of bread and ale. It was bready, slightly malty, and carried the gentle bitterness of the fermented grain. Its appeal was not in its flavor, but in its texture and its warmth. It was soft, easy to eat, and deeply comforting on a cold morning or after a long day of hard labor. This was the quintessential breakfast or simple supper for the working class. It was fast, it used up ingredients that would otherwise go to waste, and it provided instant, warm calories to start or end the day. You can picture a peasant family huddled around the hearth on a chilly evening, each with a bowl of this simple porridge, the warmth of the soups warding off the cold. It was not exciting, but it was reliable, and in the medieval world, reliability was a treasure beyond price. While the basic dish of ale-soaked bread was the standard, even this humble meal could be embellished. A peasant with a bit of extra food might crumble some salty cheese curds over their warm soups, or perhaps sprinkle on some chopped herbs from their garden for a touch of freshness. On a truly fortunate day, a freshly fried egg might be placed on top, its rich, runny yolk creating a luxurious sauce that transformed the simple dish into a veritable feast. These small additions could elevate a meal of pure necessity into something genuinely enjoyable. But the true evolution of the SOP happened when it crossed the class divide. The nobility also ate a version of soaked bread, but they swapped the humble, bitter ale for a far more refined and expensive liquid, wine, known as esops in wine. This was not a rustic breakfast, but an elegant dessert, often served at the end of a grand banquet. The bread itself would be of a higher quality, a white bread made from finely sifted flour, which was a luxury in itself. It was often toasted first, giving it a firmer texture that held up better to the soaking. The wine used was rarely a simple table wine. It was typically a sweet, spiced, and heated concoction, much like a modern mulled wine or the medieval drink known as hippocras. This wine would be rich with the flavors of expensive, imported spices like cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and nutmeg. The toasted bread would be placed in a fine ceramic bowl or a goblet, and this warm, fragrant wine would be poured over it. It was a dish to be eaten slowly with a silver spoon, a gentle and sophisticated end to an evening of feasting. The difference in the experience was immense. While the peasants' soups were about staving off hunger with the malty, slightly sour taste of weak ale, the noblemen's sops were an indulgence of flavor and aroma. They were warm, sweet, and fragrant, the bread saturated with the complex flavors of the spiced wine. It was a comforting, mildly intoxicating, and incredibly luxurious dish. Sometimes nuts or dried fruits would be added, further enhancing its status as a delicacy reserved for the wealthy. The two versions of SOPs serve as a perfect illustration of the vast social chasm that defined the medieval world. The fundamental concept was identical, reviving stale bread with liquid, yet one version was a symbol of survival, of making do with the bare essentials. The other was a symbol of incredible privilege, a dish defined by leisure, expensive ingredients, and refined taste. It's a powerful reminder that in the Middle Ages, even the simplest of foods could tell a profound story about a person's place in the world. In the medieval world, fresh fruit was a fleeting and precious gift. An apple, a pear, or a handful of berries were glorious in their season, but their season was short, and they would spoil quickly. For a society that needed to survive long, barren winters, the ability to preserve the sweetness of the summer harvest was a vital skill. The simplest and most ancient method of doing this was by drying, a process that transformed soft, perishable fruit into a tough, durable, and intensely sweet snack, medieval dried fruit. The process was entirely dependent on the power of the sun and air. Fruits like grapes, figs, and plums would be laid out on large cloths or woven mats under the hot summer sun. For days or even weeks, they would be left to bake in the heat, slowly shriveling as their water content evaporated. In the less reliable climates of northern Europe, fruit might be sliced thinly and dried near the warmth of the hearth, or placed in the residual heat of a bake oven after the day's bread was done. The goal was to remove moisture, the agent of rot and decay, and concentrate the natural sugars within. The resulting product was a world away from the soft, plump, dried fruits we know today. Medieval dried fruit was often tough, leathery, and aggressively chewy. The drying process made them incredibly dense and concentrated their sweetness to an almost candy-like intensity. To eat a medieval dried fig or prune required a strong jaw and a good deal of determination. They were wrinkled, sticky, and sometimes so hard they seemed more like sweet pebbles than fruit. But this very toughness was a sign of their incredible durability. The types of dried fruit available depended heavily on geography and wealth. In many parts of Europe, sliced apples and pears were commonly dried at home, providing a domestic source of sweetness for the winter. But the most coveted dried fruits were the ones that spoke of sun-drenched, distant lands. Figs, dates, and sweet raisins, made from grapes, were imported at great expense from the Mediterranean and the Middle East. For most people, these were rare luxuries, a taste of an exotic world that they would likely only encounter on the most special of feast days. Despite their sometimes challenging texture, dried fruits were one of the most practical and important snacks of the age. They were, in essence, the original energy bar. Lightweight, nutrient-dense, and incredibly shelf-stable, they were the perfect food for anyone on the move. A soldier on campaign, a merchant on a trade route, or a pilgrim on their way to a holy shrine could carry a small pouch of dried fruit that would provide an instant burst of energy and sweetness. It was nature's own convenience food, a pocketful of preserved sunshine to brighten the hardest of journeys. While dried fruit was a convenient snack in its own right, its true importance was as an ingredient in the medieval kitchen. The medieval palate had a pronounced fondness for mixing sweet and savory flavors, a taste profile that might seem unusual to us today, but was the height of sophistication at the time. A handful of chopped prunes or raisins would be a common addition to a rich, savory meat stew or pie. As they cooked, the fruits would break down, adding a deep, sweet, and slightly tangy flavor to the sauce, balancing the saltiness of the meat. In the kitchens of castles and manors, a well-stocked pantry would always include a generous supply of various dried fruits. They were a cornerstone of elite cuisine. Cooks would use them to create complex and flavorful sauces for roasted meats, stuff them inside game birds before roasting, or use them to add a touch of sweetness and luxury to vegetable dishes. The presence of a variety of imported dried fruits, costly figs from Spain, sticky dates from North Africa, was a clear indicator of a wealthy and well-connected household, a testament to the Lord's ability to procure the finest ingredients from across the known world. In a world where refined sugar was a rare and precious commodity, dried fruits, along with honey, were the workhorse sweeteners for many cooks. To sweeten a morning porridge, a cook could chop and stir in some dried apples. To make a simple pudding, they might soak and mash dried figs into a thick, sweet paste. This method provided not just sweetness, but also flavor, texture, and nutritional value, making it a far more common and practical approach than using expensive and one-dimensional sugar. However, this sweet and convenient food came with a significant and painful drawback. The tough, leathery texture and the intensely sticky nature of medieval dried fruit were a constant threat to dental health. In an age with no professional dentists and where a toothache could become a life-threatening infection, this was no small matter. The sticky sugars from dates and figs would cling stubbornly to the teeth, promoting decay, while biting down on a particularly hard, stone-like dried pear could easily lead to a chipped or broken tooth. Enjoying this sweet treat was always a calculated risk. Finally, it's worth remembering that this was a food with an incredibly ancient lineage. The practice of drying fruit goes back thousands of years to the civilizations of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Rome. For the people of the Middle Ages, who looked back to the classical and biblical worlds with a sense of reverence, eating figs, dates, and raisins was a tangible connection to that ancient past. It was a food that had nourished travelers, armies, and civilizations for millennia, a timeless taste of preserved sweetness that had been passed down through the ages. We now delve into a food that embodies the most fundamental principle of the medieval kitchen. Absolutely nothing is wasted. When an animal, most often a pig, was slaughtered, it was a momentous occasion, and every single part of the animal was put to use. The meat was preserved, the fat was rendered, the bones were boiled for broth, and even the intestines were used as sausage casings. But what about the most perishable part of all, the blood? This nutrient-rich liquid had to be used immediately, and from this necessity, a dark, savory, and surprisingly popular snack was born: the blood pudding ball. The creation of this dish begins at the very moment of slaughter. The fresh blood was carefully collected in a large basin and immediately stirred to prevent it from coagulating completely. To this crimson base, a number of key ingredients were added. The most important was a filler, something to give the pudding substance and stretch the precious blood as far as possible. This was usually a grain, like oats or barley, or sometimes coarse, stale breadcrumbs. Finely chopped suet, a hard, crumbly animal fat, was added for richness and moisture, along with onions for flavor. This thick, dark, and admittedly grim-looking mixture was then heavily seasoned. Salt and black pepper were essential, but other spices, like mace or allspice, might be included if available. While this pudding could be stuffed into casings to make a traditional sausage, a clever variation was to shape it by hand into small, dense balls. These were then gently poached in simmering water or broth until they were cooked through and firm. At this stage, they were stable and could be stored for a short time. But the final transformation, the step that turned this pudding into a true junk food snack, was the frying. These cooked pudding balls would be tossed into a skillet of sizzling hot lard. The exterior would crisp up beautifully, becoming dark, slightly blistered, and wonderfully crunchy. The inside, however, would remain soft, moist, and rich. This contrast between the crispy shell and the tender interior was what made them so appealing. You would often find them being fried up at market stalls, sending a uniquely savory and earthy aroma into the air. To eat a fresh, hot blood pudding ball was to experience a powerful and complex set of flavors and textures. First came the crispy, greasy exterior, followed by the soft, almost crumbly pudding within. The taste was intensely savory, rich, and earthy, with a distinct metallic temps from the iron in the blood. It was a snack that was incredibly warming and astonishingly filling. In a world where nutrient deficiencies were common, these iron-rich orbs were not just a treat. They were a potent source of energy and sustenance, a perfect food for a cold day. Blood pudding, in all its forms, was intrinsically tied to the cycle of animal husbandry and the rhythm of the seasons. It was most commonly made in the autumn, after the pigs had been fattened over the summer and were slaughtered before the onset of winter. This made it a seasonal delicacy, a food that signaled a brief, glorious moment of abundance. The day of the slaughter was a significant event in a village or on a farmstead, and the immediate creation of blood pudding was a way to both celebrate and efficiently process the fresh bounty. Despite its practicality, this was a food that undoubtedly divided opinion. Even in the Middle Ages, its intense, unique flavor and its very nature meant that it was not for the faint of heart or the delicate of palate. While many appreciated its rich, savory taste and nourishing properties, others likely found the concept of eating blood unsettling. It was a bold food, unapologetic in its ingredients and its strong, earthy character. You either loved it or you learned to politely decline when it was offered. The people who most appreciated this snack were those who needed it most. The hard laborers, a blacksmith working at his hot forge all day, a stonemason hauling heavy blocks, or a farmer spending long hours in the cold fields, would have seen these pudding balls as a perfect source of fuel. They were dense, portable, and packed with the protein, fat, and iron needed to sustain a body through grueling physical work. Eating one or two was a quick lunch. Eating a few more was a surefire way to power through the rest of the day's tasks. This type of food was by no means unique to one region. All across medieval Europe, wherever livestock was raised, you would find local versions of blood sausage or pudding. The French had their boudin noir, the Spanish their morcilla. The specific spices and fillers might change from place to place. Some might use rice instead of oats, others might add different herbs, but the core principle remained the same. It was a universal solution to the universal problem of how to use every last part of a precious animal. In the end, the blood pudding ball stands as one of the most direct and honest links we have to the medieval diet. It is a food untouched by romanticism. It's not elegant, it's not refined, but it is a powerful symbol of a time when resourcefulness was the highest virtue. It represents a pragmatic and unsentimental relationship with food, where survival and sustenance were prized above all else. It is a taste of a tougher, more practical world, and a testament to the enduring ingenuity of people who knew how to find nourishment in the most unlikely of places. For our next dish, I must ask you to forget everything you know about the modern version. Forget tall, fluffy stacks. Forget whipped cream and fresh blueberries. Forget the delicate streams of maple syrup. The medieval pancake was a different beast entirely. It was thinner, tougher, often greasier, and served a much more fundamental purpose than being a cheerful weekend breakfast. It was a fast, simple, and versatile way to turn flour into a hot meal, and it was a staple across all levels of society. The batter for a medieval pancake was, like so many foods of the era, beautifully simple. It consisted of flour, eggs, and a liquid. The flour was rarely the fine, white wheat flour we use today. More often, it was a coarser grind of barley, rye, or a mix of whatever grains were available. The liquid was typically water, milk, if you were fortunate, or very commonly, a splash of ale. This thin batter was then ready for the fire, with no need for rising agents or resting time. It was immediate and efficient. The cooking process was what truly defined the medieval pancake. It was cooked on a hot griddle, which could be a flat slab of iron or even a smooth, heated stone placed over the embers of a fire. Before the batter was poured, the griddle was greased, and greased generously. This was not a delicate swipe with a butter wrapper. This was a large spoonful of lard or pig fat, melted until it was shimmering and sizzling hot. The thin batter was then ladled onto this scorching, greasy surface, where it would spread into an uneven circle, cooking almost instantly. The result was a flat, rustic griddle cake. It was not thick or fluffy, but thin and flexible, more akin to a modern crepe, but with a rougher texture. The edges would be brown, crispy, and almost lace-like from the hot fat, while the center remained soft and slightly chewy. You could roll it, fold it, or simply eat it flat. It was a food designed to be made quickly and eaten immediately, a perfect solution for a fast meal at any time of day. Pancakes were a remarkably democratic food. Everyone from the humblest peasant to the king himself ate them. They were a simple and effective way to use up flour, eggs, and a bit of fat. The great difference, as always, was in how they were served. A farmer might eat his pancake plain, perhaps with a pinch of salt. A nobleman, on the other hand, would have his served with a drizzle of honey, a dusting of expensive spices, or alongside stewed fruit. The humble pancake was a blank canvas, and what you painted on it was a clear sign of your station in life. The humble pancake was more than just a quick meal. It held a significant place in the cultural and religious calendar. Its most famous association is with Shrove Tuesday, the day before the beginning of Lent. Lent was a solemn 40-day period of fasting and prayer, during which rich foods like eggs, milk, and fat were strictly forbidden. Shrove Tuesday was therefore the last opportunity for households to use up these perishable, prohibited ingredients. The pancake, which required eggs, milk or water, flour, and a good deal of fat for frying, was the perfect recipe for the occasion. On this day, kitchens across Christendom would have been filled with the sound and smell of pancakes being fried up, a final feast before the lean weeks ahead. Beyond this annual tradition, the pancake's versatility made it a culinary workhorse. Its thin, flexible nature made it an excellent edible wrapper. A cook could take a freshly made pancake and fill it with any number of savory ingredients. Some leftover chopped meat from a roast, a spoonful of thick vegetable pottage, or some crumbled cheese and herbs. Rolled up tightly, it became a neat, self-contained meal, a medieval ancestor of the modern burrito or savory crepe. This was a clever way to repackage leftovers into a new and more interesting dish. In a similar vein, a pancake could also serve as a makeshift plate. For many people in the Middle Ages, individual plates were not common. Instead, food was often served on a thick, hard slice of stale bread known as a trencher. A large, plain pancake could function in much the same way. A scoop of stew could be ladled onto the center of the pancake, which would absorb the juices and gravy. After the main course was finished, you could then eat the sauce-soaked plate itself, ensuring that absolutely nothing went to waste. This incredible utility made pancakes the ultimate convenience food of their time. They could be cooked in a matter of moments over a simple fire, without the need for a large, specialized oven. For a traveler stopping at an inn, a soldier in a temporary camp, or a family in need of a quick, hot meal without much fuss, pancakes were a perfect and reliable option. Their simplicity was their greatest strength. The legacy of the medieval pancake is a testament to its brilliant practicality. While we now think of pancakes as a sweet and indulgent breakfast treat, their ancestor was a far more adaptable and fundamental part of daily life. It was a food that could be a festive indulgence, a clever way to handle leftovers, an edible plate, and a quick meal all in one. It was a true multitasker in the medieval kitchen, a simple food that perfectly reflects a world where resourcefulness and versatility were virtues of the highest order. Our next snack is one of the most delicate and curious of the medieval period, a food that existed in a strange space between sacred ritual and common street food. It was lighter than air, incredibly fragile, and could be found both on the altar of a church and in the hands of a child at a village fair. We are speaking of the medieval wafer. This thin, crisp biscuit held a dual identity that makes it a fascinating window into the medieval world, where the lines between the holy and the mundane were often beautifully blurred. The secret to the wafer's unique character lies in the special tool used to create it, the wafer iron. This was a heavy, long-handled implement that looked something like a pair of blacksmith's tongs, but with two flat, circular iron plates at the end instead of pincers. These plates were often intricately engraved with beautiful designs. Some bore geometric patterns or floral motifs, while others were adorned with family crests, coats of arms, or sacred images like the crucifix or the Lamb of God. The wafer iron was both a cooking utensil and a work of art. The process of making a wafer was one of speed and precision. A cook would prepare a very thin, liquid batter, often not much more than fine flour and water. For secular wafers meant as a treat, a bit of honey, egg, or fragrant rosewater might be added to the mix. A small amount of this batter was ladled onto one of the hot plates of the iron. The heavy device was then clamped shut, squeezing the batter into a paper-thin layer and forcing it into every detail of the engraved pattern. The iron was held over an open fire for just a few moments, the batter cooking almost instantly in the intense, enclosed heat. Wafers were a hugely popular street food. Vendors, known as wafers, were a common sight in the bustling streets of medieval towns, especially on market days or outside cathedrals on major feast days. They would work over a small charcoal brazier, their long-handled irons clanging as they opened and closed them, pulling out sheet after sheet of hot, fragrant wafers. They would sell them in stacks to hungry passers-by, a light, affordable, and easily portable snack for the masses. To eat a medieval wafer was to experience something ethereal. It was so light it felt like almost nothing in your hand, and so fragile that it would shatter with the slightest pressure. The texture was its main appeal, a delicate, crisp crackle that dissolved in the mouth. The flavor was often very subtle, a mild sweetness and the pleasant taste of toasted flour. It wasn't a snack meant to fill you up. It was a fleeting moment of delicate texture and gentle flavor, a small and simple pleasure in a coarse and heavy world. The simple wafer carried with it a profound religious significance that would have been understood by everyone in the Middle Ages. Its form was nearly identical to that of the communion wafer, the unleavened host that was consecrated during the Mass to become the body of Christ. These sacred wafers were also made with a simple flour and water batter and baked in special irons, often bearing the image of the crucifixion. This association lent the secular street wafer a certain aura of reverence. For the deeply devout populace, eating a wafer, even a sweet one bought at a fair, was a faint and humble echo of the most sacred rite of their faith. This connection did not prevent the wafer from becoming a feature of elite dining. In fact, in noble households, wafers were a popular and fashionable dessert. They were valued for their lightness, providing a delicate and welcome contrast to the heavy, rich courses that typically made up a banquet. Here, they were not simply eaten plain, but were used as a component in more elaborate and creative sweet dishes. A cook could take a wafer fresh from the iron, and while it was still warm and pliable, roll it into a cone to be filled with fruit preserves or a sweet, spiced cream. They were also used as a kind of edible utensil or platform. A crisp, flat wafer could be layered with soft cheese and drizzled with honey, creating an early ancestor of a modern cheesecake dessert. They could be used to scoop up soft puddings or thick fruit compotes, their crispness providing a delightful textural contrast. The ability to produce perfect, unbroken, and beautifully patterned wafers was a mark of a highly skilled kitchen staff, a subtle but clear signal of a household's refinement and wealth. These elegant wafer creations were often served during the private after-banquet ritual we have previously discussed, alongside spiced wine and candied comfits. A plate of delicately rolled wafers, perhaps filled with a sweet almond paste, was the height of sophisticated snacking. It was a food that was simultaneously light on the stomach and heavy with status, a perfect end to an evening of opulent dining. Perhaps the most surprising legacy of the medieval wafer is one we still see today. The practice of rolling the hot, pliable wafer into a cone is the direct ancestor of the modern ice cream cone. This simple, fragile snack, born from a mixture of religious observance and street food culture, has left an indelible mark on our culinary world in a way its creators could never have imagined. Every time we enjoy a scoop of ice cream in a crispy cone, we are partaking in a tradition that began centuries ago over the charcoal braziers and in the castle kitchens of the Middle Ages. We now arrive at the pinnacle of medieval sweet treats, a confection so luxurious and labor-intensive that it was reserved for the wealthiest of the wealthy. This was a snack that was less a food and more an edible jewel, a sticky, syrupy indulgence known as sucket. The name itself sounds delightfully sweet, and it referred to pieces of fruit, root, or even vegetable stems that were slowly candied and preserved in a thick syrup. Unlike the hard, dry comfits, sucket was soft, wet, and glistening, a truly decadent experience. The ingredients chosen for sucket were often as exotic as the process itself. The most prized items were those that had to be imported at great expense. The peel of oranges and lemons, fruits that were rare and costly in most of medieval Europe, were a particular favorite. The spicy, pungent root of ginger was another. To transform these already precious ingredients into sucket was to elevate them to an even higher plane of luxury. Imagine a castle cook carefully peeling an orange, knowing that the fragrant peel was destined for a treatment that would make it more valuable than gold by weight. The creation of sucket was a slow, deliberate, and fuel-intensive process. The fruit peel, or ginger root, would first be boiled, often in several changes of water, to soften its texture and remove any bitterness. Then, it was placed in a pot with a thick, heavy syrup made from honey or, for the ultimate display of wealth, highly refined sugar. The mixture was then simmered gently over a low heat for hours, or even days. The goal was for the fruit to become completely saturated with the sugar syrup, turning it translucent and preserving it perfectly in its sweet, sticky bath. Because it was a wet and syrupy confection, sucket was not served simply on a plate. It was presented in beautiful, ornate containers, small glass jars, fine porcelain pots, or silver dishes that further enhanced its status as a luxury item. It was eaten with small, delicate spoons or two-pronged forks, as touching it with your fingers would result in a sticky mess. This was not a casual snack, but a formal and elegant part of the dessert course at the most exclusive banquet tables. Sucket was, in every sense, a performance of power. To serve it told your guests several things at once. It showed that you had access to the international trade routes that brought exotic fruits and spices to your door. It demonstrated that you could afford the exorbitant cost of sugar, and it proved that you had a household with enough resources to dedicate a skilled cook and a huge amount of expensive firewood to such a painstaking and lengthy process. To eat a piece of sucket was to taste wealth itself. Much like its dry cousin, the comfit sucket also walked the fine line between being a confection and a form of medicine. In the world of humoral theory, candied ginger was particularly prized. Ginger was considered a hot and dry spice, making it the perfect remedy to counteract the cold and wet qualities of a heavy, rich meal. A physician might prescribe a piece of sucket made from ginger to a wealthy patient to aid their digestion, warm their stomach, or ward off melancholy. For the medieval elite, enjoying this delicious, sugary treat could be framed as a sensible and health-conscious decision. The art of preserving things in syrup was not limited to expensive imported fruits. Creative cooks applied the sucket technique to a variety of more common plants. The crisp, hollow stems of the angelica plant, an herb which grew widely in European gardens, were a popular candidate. When candied, they produced a beautiful, translucent green treat with a unique, slightly herbal, anise-like flavor. The roots of eringo, or sea holly, were also candied and believed to have medicinal properties. This demonstrates a desire to take the luxurious technique of the elite and apply it to the familiar plants of the local landscape. One of the greatest appeals of sucket was its incredible shelf life. The vast quantity of sugar in the syrup acted as a powerful preservative, protecting the fruit from rot and decay. A well-made pot of sucket, if sealed properly from the air, could last for many months, perhaps even years. This made it an incredibly valuable asset in a wealthy household's pantry. It was a store of sweetness and flavor that could be enjoyed throughout the winter and spring, long after the last fresh fruits of autumn had been consumed. It was a taste of summer, preserved in a jar. Naturally, the common person could only dream of tasting true sucket made with refined sugar. But that didn't stop them from creating their own rustic imitations. A farmer's wife might take the tough rinds of pears or other fruits and boil them down in honey, perhaps with a few cloves for flavor, until they were soft and syrupy. The result would be a dark, intensely sweet, and sticky, jam-like concoction. It lacked the delicacy and jewel-like clarity of noble sucket, but it served the same purpose, to preserve what little fruit they had, and to provide a much-needed taste of sweetness during the lean months. The legacy of sucket is still with us in our modern kitchens. It is the direct ancestor of the candied, or fruit that we use in baking today, especially around the holidays. The candied citrus peel in a fruitcake, the bright green angelica used for decoration, the crystallized ginger we enjoy as a treat, All of these are descendants of the sticky, syrupy luxury that once graced the tables of medieval kings and queens. What was once a symbol of ultimate wealth has become a common and beloved ingredient for all. We come now to our final course in this tour of medieval junk food, and it is perhaps the most quintessentially medieval of them all. It is a food that was beloved by all social classes, from the poorest peasant to the king himself. It was a creature that filled the rivers and marshes of Europe, a slippery, serpentine, and slightly sinister-looking animal that, against all modern logic, became one of the most popular foods of the age. We are speaking, of course, of the eel. Eels were everywhere in the medieval landscape. They thrived in the slow-moving rivers, streams, and fens that crisscrossed the continent. They were incredibly easy to catch using woven wicker traps, making them a cheap, abundant, and reliable source of protein for the common person. Monasteries, with their sophisticated understanding of aquaculture, even farmed eels in specially constructed ponds, ensuring a constant supply for the monks' tables. This ubiquity made the eel a familiar, if unusual, staple of the diet. One of the biggest reasons for the eel's immense popularity was a religious loophole. According to the dietary rules of the church, eel was classified as a fish, not as meat. This meant that it was perfectly permissible to eat during the long, strict fasting periods of Lent, as well as on Fridays and other designated fast days. While beef, pork, and poultry were forbidden, a hearty plate of eel was allowed. This made it an incredibly important food, a savory and satisfying protein source during times when the menu was otherwise very restricted. However, a love of eel came with its own challenges, starting with the preparation. The eel is a notoriously slippery and powerful creature, and preparing one for the pot was not a task for the squeamish. The process of skinning an eel was famously difficult, more akin to wrestling with a muscular, slimy rope than filleting a typical fish. It required strength, a firm grip, and a good deal of resolve. Yet this unpleasant task was undertaken daily in kitchens across Europe, a testament to how much people enjoyed the final product. The most common and straightforward way to cook eel, turning it into a veritable fast food, was simply to fry it. After the difficult process of skinning and cleaning, the eel would be chopped into short, bite-sized sections. These pieces were often coated in a dusting of seasoned flour or dipped in a simple batter before being dropped into a pan of sizzling, hot lard or oil. The outside would become wonderfully crisp and golden brown, while the rich, fatty meat inside would become firm, white, and tender. The taste of simple fried eel was what made the difficult preparation worthwhile. The crispy, seasoned coating gave way to meat that was firm, white, and surprisingly rich, with a mild flavor that some have compared to chicken or unshelled scallops. However, eating eel came with one significant challenge: the bones. Eels are filled with many fine, needle-like bones, which made every bite a careful negotiation. You could not eat it mindlessly. It demanded your full attention, lest you get a sharp surprise. While the common person enjoyed their eel simply fried, the nobility, as always, had far grander ambitions for this versatile creature. In the kitchens of castles and manors, the eel was transformed into magnificent centerpiece dishes. One of the most famous and beloved of these was the eel pie. A large, ornate pie would be filled with chunks of eel, often stewed in a rich, savory sauce of wine and spices, then baked under a thick pastry crust. It was a dish worthy of a king's banquet, and English royalty, in particular, were known to be extremely fond of it. Another popular preparation, especially in England, was jellied eel. The eel would be chopped and simmered in a seasoned stock, which would then be allowed to cool. The natural gelatin from the eel's skin and bones would cause the stock to set into a savory jelly, encasing the pieces of meat. While this might seem unappetizing to many of us today, it was considered a delicacy, a cool and refreshing dish that was both flavorful and visually appealing in its shimmering, wobbly presentation. The eel, therefore, held a unique and contradictory place in the medieval food chain. It was one of the few foods that was eaten with equal enthusiasm by the lowest peasant and the highest king. A poor fisherman might fry up his catch for a simple supper by the riverbank, while at the same time, 100 miles away in a grand castle, a royal chef could be constructing an enormous, elaborately decorated eel pie as the show-stopping centerpiece of a royal feast. The eel was a great unifier, a food that appeared on every table. Today, the eel's status as a staple food has all but vanished from most Western cuisines. What was once a ubiquitous and cherished source of protein is now often seen as a strange and adventurous dish, a culinary curiosity rather than a daily meal. It stands as a powerful reminder of how dramatically tastes can change over the centuries, and how a food that once defined an era can fade into the background of history, its former glory only visible in the pages of old recipe books and historical accounts. As our long journey through the streets, kitchens, and castles of the Middle Ages comes to a close, we can look back on the incredible variety of snacks and treats we've uncovered. From the rugged practicality of the meat pasty to the delicate, holy echo of the wafer. From the sweet, greasy delight of an apple fritter to the strange, savory crunch of a fried eel. Each of these foods tells its own story, but together they weave a grander tapestry, revealing the very nature of medieval life. A powerful theme that connects nearly every dish we've explored is that of ingenuity born from scarcity. These were not chefs with fully stocked pantries, inventing dishes for pleasure. These were ordinary people solving problems. What do you do with stale bread? You soak it in ale. What do you do with the blood of a slaughtered animal? You mix it with oats and fry it. How do you make a bland turnip feel like a celebration? You hide it in a pie crust with a bit of honey. This resourcefulness, this refusal to waste a single scrap, is the true genius of the medieval kitchen. Another common thread is the stark and constant reflection of the social hierarchy. We saw how the same basic concept could be transformed by wealth and status. A peasant ate a pasty of uncertain filling, while a lord ate one of prime venison. A farmer soaked his bread in ale for sustenance, while a noble soaked his in spiced wine for pleasure. Sugar-dusted fritters and jewel-like suckets were for the rich. Honey-sweetened cakes and squeaky cheese curds were for everyone else. Food was one of the most visible and potent symbols of your station in life. This journey also reveals a palate that was very different from our own. The medieval love for combining sweet and savory, the heavy reliance on a few powerful spices, and the acceptance of textures that we might find challenging, chewy, tough, or greasy, all point to a different culinary world. Flavor was often bold and direct, meant to stand up to coarse ingredients, or, in some cases, to mask flavors that were less than fresh. It was a cuisine built on practicality and strong sensations rather than subtle nuance. Finally, it's worth reconsidering our modern term, junk food, in this context. While these foods were often quick, convenient, and indulgent, they were almost never junk in the sense of being empty calories. The pasty, the blood pudding, the cheese curd, these were dense with fat and protein for a reason. They were fuel for a life of hard, physical labor. They were designed to provide lasting energy, not a fleeting sugar rush. In that sense, medieval junk food was perhaps more honest than our own. It was unapologetically hearty, designed to sustain life in a world that demanded strength and endurance above all else. The foods of the past can seem strange, sometimes unappetizing, and often very distant from our own experience. Yet, as we've seen, they are also deeply familiar. The desire for a warm, handheld pie on a cold day, the simple joy of a sweet, fried treat, the comfort of a soft, starchy meal when you are tired. These are not just medieval desires, they are human desires. The pie, the fritter, and the pancake are still with us, transformed by time and technology, but recognizable still. The echoes of their kitchens are present in our own. To study these humble foods is to understand the people who made them in a uniquely intimate way. The recipes, born of necessity and imagination, tell a story that grand histories of battles and kings often miss. It is a story of daily life, of resourcefulness, of small pleasures, and of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. The taste of their world, in all its savory, sweet, and sometimes strange complexity, is a direct link to their reality, a way for us to connect with them across the centuries. Thank you for joining me on this long and flavorful journey into the world of medieval junk food. It has been a pleasure to explore these forgotten corners of the kitchen with you here on Medieval Nocturnes. I hope this story has given you a new appreciation for the simple foods we often take for granted, and perhaps a little comfort as you prepare for sleep. If you enjoyed this exploration and would like to join us for more quiet journeys into the past, please do take a moment to subscribe to the channel and perhaps like the video to let us know. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these fascinating histories. We hope to see you again. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, and may your dreams be filled with the quiet, comforting echoes of history. Sleep well,